Hi everybody, this is Mr. Johnstone here, and this is me and my daughter Katie on vacation in Cape Cod this past summer. While we were there, we were playing in the tide pools, and she was having a great time swimming around, and we found all kinds of really cool biological stuff. One afternoon, she saw something in the sand, and she kind of reached for it, and she picked it up. And I could see in her eyes, she was wondering, what is this thing? And so she gave it to me, and I started to wonder too, what is this thing? And then it dawned on me, I know what this thing is. It's a hermit crab. See, hermit crabs live in the sandy areas and the tide pools around Cape Cod and around a lot of ocean areas. But you see, hermit crab's not a good name because chances are there are lots of different kinds of hermit crabs. So what kind of hermit crab is this? You see, scientists give animals and all organisms scientific names so that we know exactly what kind of organism we're talking about. And properly classifying and giving organisms good scientific names is what this video tutorial is all about. The first main point for this video is that organisms are classified based on their physical similarities. So if you were to look at this organism here, it's called a pangolin, and it's native to Africa, I believe. And if you were to try to classify it into a group of organisms that you already know, you might have a little bit of trouble. For example, it looks like it has scales, and that's sort of a reptile thing. And if you were to look closely at its snout, you'd realize that it doesn't have teeth, and it has something more related to a beak. And that's very bird-like, yet you're not going to call this a bird, so it's hard to classify this organism. Turns out scientists have been able to identify that this is a type of mammal, and they call it a pangolin, but it's the only type of creature in its group. So let's talk about groups and how we name different organisms. So a very famous scientist named Linnaeus, his first name was Carl. So Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s developed a scientific naming system that we still use today. And we call it taxonomy. Taxonomy is simply the science of naming and classifying organisms so that we can keep them all organized. For example, here's my hermit crab again that I found on Cape Cod. Its common name is the long-clawed hermit crab. And if you look closely, you'll see that its claw is actually quite long. And the scientific name is Pagurus longicarpus. We would say that Pagurus longicarpus is a taxon. It's a group of organisms in a classification system. In other words, this taxon includes all long-clawed hermit crabs because they're all one species. But we can also consider Pagurus as a group can also be a taxon, or a group of organisms in the classification system. For example, there are different Paguruses. So there's Pagurus polycharis, which looks a lot different than the hermit crab that I found, Pagurus longicarpus. And there's also Pagurus annulepes. All three of these hermit crabs occur on the east coast of the United States, and they're all part of one group called Pagurus. But they all have slightly different second words in their name, but we would call them all a taxon, because taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms. So you can have one type of species that is a taxon, or you can have a group of species that's also a taxon. We use a system called binomial nomenclature to name our organisms. And we use Latin words in this system, and the scientific names are always written in italics or underlined, and there's always two parts to the name. So this word binomial nomenclature, we can kind of break it down. Bi means two, nomial means name, so to name, and then nomenclature means naming system. So that makes sense. And you have two parts to the name. You have the first part, the first word, which is called the genus, and the second word, or the second part of the name, which is called the species. So every species has two names. Again, Pagurus longicarpus is the genus and the species for the hermit crab that I found. So in this system, the first name, the genus, includes one or more physically similar species. Species in the same genus are thought to be closely related. Remember, all the Pagurus crabs are all related, or at least they're thought to be related, and they're all given that first genus name because we believe that they're related. And we always capitalize the genus word in the binomial nomenclature, and the species descriptor is that second word in the scientific name, and it's always lowercase. And it always follows the genus name, and it's never written alone. For example, longicarpus isn't a good name for my hermit crab. You have to say Pagurus longicarpus in order to know exactly what kind of hermit crab you're talking about. Here's another example. Tito alba is the barn owl. Tito is its genus name. Alba is its species descriptor. The first word, the genus, is capitalized, but both words are in italics, so this is in proper format. So barn owl is the common name, but Tito alba is the scientific name for this bird. Here's some other examples of scientific names. For example, roly-poly or a pill bug or whatever you would call it, like a sow bug or a potato bug. Its scientific name is actually Armadillium vulgare. And notice you have a genus and a species name, two names. So you could say this name to anybody in the world, any scientist in the world, and they would know exactly what you're talking about. Other examples here are the dandelion, the house sparrow, the mountain lion, and the red maple. Notice the genus is always capitalized, the specific descriptor is always lowercase, but there's always two words for these binomial names. So Linnaeus' system was more than just about names, it was about organization. So Linnaeus' system has 7 different levels of classification, and each level above it is bigger and included more organisms than the one below it. So we can start with the biggest category, and that's the kingdom category. These are things like plants and animals and very large groups that include all kinds of organisms. In this example here, you can see Animalia is the Latin name or the Latin kingdom for all that includes all animals. If we go down the next level in the organization here on the diagram, you can see that the next level is called a phylum, and an example of a phylum is Chordata. Chordata means all animals that have a backbone. So notice in the picture, all the species that don't have a backbone have been eliminated because they're not included in the phylum Chordata. The next level down is class. This example is Mammalia, for example, all mammals. And then we can go to order. The order Carnivora includes all carnivores. The family Canidae includes all dog-like animals. The genus Canis includes things that we would be very familiar with, including wolves and domestic dogs. And then the species Canis lupus is the gray wolf or the North American wolf. And remember, there's always two names, the genus and the specific descriptor. So Canis is its genus, lupus is the specific descriptor, but you gotta have both names. So Canis lupus is the North American wolf or the gray wolf. This system has some limitations, though. Linnaeus' taxonomy system doesn't account for molecular evidence because the technology for sequencing, for example, genes or DNA of organisms didn't exist in Linnaeus' time, but we have that system now. Linnaeus' system was based only on physical similarities. One great example of this limitation here is to think about mushrooms or fungi. They're actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, even though a mushroom, for example, and a lot of fungi actually look like plants, and for a long time they were included in the plant group. But when we sequence their DNA, we find out that animals and fungi are actually more closely related through evolution than fungi are to plants. And I just think that's pretty interesting. The next key point here is that the close relationships that we infer because things look alike aren't always correct, and that genetic similarities actually give us a better picture. For example, this is a red panda. It looks like the more familiar giant panda, and in fact, for a while, they are both given very similar names, and their common names are also very similar even today. We give them both the name panda. But it turns out that giant pandas are more closely related to bears, and red pandas are more closely related to raccoons. So they're actually not very closely related to each other at all, aside from both being mammals. So even though we both call them pandas, they belong or can be classified into two distinct groups, the giant panda being classified into bears, and the red panda being classified into the raccoon group. So let's do a little summary here at the end of the video. First thing is that taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms, and it's not an easy science. As you can see, you have to look at the organism and see how it, other structures that it has, and sort of put it in a group. And nowadays, we actually take the DNA or the molecular evidence from the cells of the organisms to actually tell how they're related and how they should be named. Binomial nomenclature was invented by Carolus Linnaeus. Again, he was that Swedish scientist, and he sort of put into motion this very nice system based on Latin words. You always have a genus and a species. For example, here we have Panthera leo, which is the African lion. African lion is the English name for that, and someone around the world who doesn't speak English wouldn't know that name and wouldn't know what you're talking about. But if you said Panthera leo, that's the Latin name, and the person would know exactly what you're talking about. And again, Linnaeus' system also has different levels. It has 7 different levels, and those levels are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Kingdom being the biggest group, the biggest taxon that you can talk about, and genus and species being the smallest groups that you can talk about. Finally, we realized after talking about how things are similar and that we give them similar names because they look similar, we realized that the best way to classify things is with genetic similarities. And scientists can do this. We can sequence the DNA of different organisms, and we can actually find out that some organisms are actually closely related to organisms that you wouldn't think would be closely related. For example, the fungus being closely related to animals rather than to plants. So that's our video on classification, and I'll see you in our next video.